In my last video, I touched upon one of the key themes in Hollow Knight, this idea that the world is huge and uncaring in comparison to the little knight, who is small and subject to the will of the land. But, while this is a significant concept, it would not be as impactful as it is without its sister theme to complement it, that being the idea that just because something is bigger than you, it doesn't necessarily mean it's better. The giant sealed wall at the end of King's Pass, for instance, is very similar, both in appearance and interactability, to the little cracked walls you've been smashing through all the way up to this point. The only real difference is that this one towers over you, a gigantic stone monolith 6 times your height. But don't let this deter you. Remember that it doesn't matter how mighty a monolith some colossal stone chad might boast about if they're just going to stand perfectly still the whole time. It's far more important to know how to use yours, as tiny and pale as it may be. A couple of cursory swings will start to crumble the wall, and, after a few more, the entire thing will come crumbling down just as all the others did before. As it does, the game imparts upon you possibly the most important lesson, and one that will serve you well for the rest of your adventure. When faced with an imposing threat, you can always get through it by hitting it enough. As you emerge from King's Pass, a cold, quiet wind gently whistles through your skull. Taking the plunge to the stone floor below and venturing forth a few steps reveals the dilapidated ruins of what at one point must have been a grand bridge above your head, leading into the crystal peaks to the east. A few more steps brings you to a beautifully ornate street lamp, the first of a few scattered surviving remnants of the Eternal Kingdom. I know we've barely stepped out of the first area, but I do want to talk about the fonts and iconography Hollow Knight uses, as this streetlight is a great example. We can see it's coiled up into the shape of an ammonite shell, probably the first image most people would think about upon hearing the word fossil. However, right now I'm more focused on the little metal bars that form the internal segments of the shell image. They look so weak and spidery, as if they would melt into tissue paper if you looked at them for long enough. This is represented in the iron benches and gates around Dirtmouth as well. They all have a solid structure about them, but everything is designed to look pretty and delicate. Even the iconography around the title card and dialogue boxes is a visual maze of prim and proper swirls and squiggles. It releases big eating blancmange at great-grandmother's mansion while she knits a doily energy. This ornate Blackadder ITC design stands in stark contrast to the relentless, unforgiving nature that we actually experience in Hallow Nest, which leans far more into the helping great-grandfather dig a grave for the dog he just killed while he teaches you how to shave with a machete energy. It's most prevalent in the City of Tears, so I will bring this up again if I happen to think of a better reason as to why they chose this for the main artistic theme of the game. But for now I'm just going to say that it helps drive home the idea that this used to be a prosperous land of splendour which is now fallen to ruin. In any case, it's a unique design that gives the land a real sense of character. You get a feel for what the civilization must have once been like, and I feel like that's pretty impressive considering it's told to you entirely through these little background cues. Carrying on further into Dirtmouth, our pace automatically slows to a walk. The haunting yet somehow comforting theme for Dirtmouth slowly fades in, and we are informed of the town's name, Dirtmouth, the Fading Town. We didn't need to be told this. The way the houses in the foreground blend into the houses in the background, which in turn blend into a hazy blue blur, makes you feel as if this little town is hanging on to its rendering for dear life. Standing in the centre of town beneath the cold light of another ornate lamp stands Elderbug. Now, since I'm not a cold-blooded reptile and actually have some half sense of decency, I'm not going to ignore him, but instead listen to what he has to say. Elderbug has several identifying features that are similar to the knight. What with the giant horned skull, pitch-black body and little baby stick legs, you'd be forgiven for thinking Elderbug was a vessel. However, in a rather unusual design decision, it turns out that just a lot of residents of Hallow Nest happen to look like vessels. You would only have to look so far as the "is Hornet void" debate to see the truth in that. I think this must have stemmed from Team Cherry designing the characters and world first, perhaps with little or no forethought as to how their origins might link to their appearance, and then worked on the story after all this was complete. Even as the story was coming together and it was decided that vessels should be their own separate thing with a fully fledged creation story, I imagine it could have been easy to overlook the issue of other characters having similar appearances to vessels. Equally, it may have been noticed and decided that it wasn't important enough to go back and change the appearance of every single NPC that looked a bit like a vessel. I don't particularly mind it, but it does add an extra layer of confusion to an already obtrusely told story. On a brighter note, Elderbug is an absolute legend of a character. Despite his shabby surroundings, he's happy to see us and invites us to sit on the bench, something that is undeniably a fantastic idea in this game. He also advises on the otherwise emptiness of the town and the direction in which you should head next. He then goes on to explicitly state what the environment has been nudging us towards since we started our adventure. The once great kingdom of Hallownest has fallen to ruin. I do like this line, if only to validate our suspicions. It's comforting to know that there is a genuine story beneath us, and not just a collection of ruined city assets on the surface. Elderbug also drops the word dreams here, something we'll be seeing a lot more of later. For now, this line just serves as a bit of motivation if you're into the sparse roleplay elements in this game. I do find it kind of funny though that if your intention is to defeat the Radiants, Elderbug's declaration that you are seeking your dreams can be taken literally. Following this, he alludes to the plague, with which we will shortly become very closely acquainted, and ends on the banger of a line, "Perhaps dreams aren't such great things after all." Dream implications aside, this is such a sweet bit of character building for Elderbug. He's above all that adventuring malarkey. He's happy where he is. We're then introduced to the resting mechanic, wherein we get to restore all empty masks and set a checkpoint at the cost of all previously defeated minor enemies respawning. As a checkpoint, design-wise, benches are better than bonfires, and I'm willing to resort to fisticuffs if anyone disagrees. The knight looks absolutely adorable sitting there while having a rest, and the benches come in a massive variety of styles to fit whichever area they happen to be in. When we rescue Bretta later, we can sit on the bench with her, and she reacts to our presence. It's one of those really well thought out designs in this game that propel it into masterpiece tier, even if it is just a Dark Souls 1 bonfire at its core. Carrying on through town, we come across a few other houses that we can't get into yet. A sign hung on the door of one of them promises that it will be opening soon, a hint to come back and regularly check up on Dirtmouth, as it is liable to change. Jumping over the ornately designed well for now, we walk through what at one point may have been a fancy gate and find a locked door on the far east. This gives us another reason to come back to Dirtmouth, and should hopefully be a memory that's triggered when we do find a key. I mentioned this a little bit in the King's Pass video, but I just want to reiterate that Hollow Knight does an excellent job of leaving things like locked doors and inaccessible treasure at every turn, each one planting a little bulb in your brain, which lights up with inspiration whenever you find an item that will allow you to access said treasure. This would be a perfectly serviceable game design decision on its own, but Hollow Knight goes one step further and fills its world to the absolute brim with this stuff. You can't move for locked doors, out-of-reach grubs, too high platforms, vertical passageways, invincible enemies. Because of the sheer quantity of these, you're bound to forget most of them, meaning that when you come back to re-explore areas, you get a small little buzz of excitement as you realise you can now access the previously inaccessible. Finally, with nowhere else to go in this direction, we turn around and drop down the well and enter the first true level. The Forgotton Crossroads. As a quick note, I've tried to make this playthrough semi-realistic as to what a newcomer's path might be around Hallownest, while using as efficient pathing as possible. Obviously, sometimes these two things aren't always compatible with one another, so if you happen to see either some inefficient routing, or maybe behaviour that isn't accurate to how a newcomer may route, please bear in mind that I'm trying to keep a decent balance between those two. Back in 1986, Metroid broke gaming conventions by putting the morph ball on the left, making you have to go against your brain's intuitive desire to progress by going right, the same way we read. Hollow Knight is a little bit more complex than that, in the sense that going right here won't halt your progress until you go left, but if you're a bit of a contrarian like me, you still might want to check out the left-hand path first. Dropping down at the first hole in the ground reveals a familiar shiny rock chock full of geo, being guarded by an unfamiliar enemy. The wandering husk will stray mopingly, electing to engage in some contemplative shoe inspection, until it spots you and charges towards you in a series of short bursts of speed, stopping occasionally to catch its breath before resuming its crazed attack. If you ever leave its line of sight, it will promptly forget about you and go back to its aimless wandering. Despite being the first humanoid enemy we've encountered, well, buganoid, I suppose, the wandering husk seems far less intelligent than the mad vengeflies in King's Pass. This provides a lot of veracity to Elderbug's statement that Hallownest is nothing more than a tomb of monsters and madness. To actually witness the effect that the plague has had on what was presumably once a person sets the stage for the grand machinations of the Radiance. The little orange dots in its eyes will soon become a fierce denotation of this plague, and before long we'll be treating everything with this sickening orange colour palette with suspicion. It stands out so sharply from the balmy blues and blacks we're used to so far, a clear indication that something unnatural has happened to this poor bug. To put the wandering husk out of its misery takes 3 slashes, which at least suggests it had a hardier constitution to the vengeflies. It's not necessarily a harder enemy to defeat, but a different enemy. The enemy variety in this game is something else Team Cherry did not need to go so incredibly hard on, but the fact that they did makes Hallownest feel exactly like a mad, sprawling underground tomb it's been described as. Continuing to the left, we come across a happy little bug couple, a familiar crawlid and an as yet unknown tick-tick pace around in this little opening. We learn here that tick-ticks can crawl on any side of a surface, and we're once again strongly encouraged to try flailing our nail upwards, as well as from the side to side. The more times the game reinforces the idea that we can swing upwards will, with any luck, cause an experimental player to try slashing downwards, thereby unlocking an entire secret method of combat that the game never even once tells you about it. I love this, but I've got to hold off on opening another tangent about it until we at least get to fungal wastes. Leaving this seemingly passive tick-tick alive, we enter the next room on the left and are greeted by a swarm of erratic gruzzers, mindlessly DVD playering around a gigantic disused elevator shaft. As we make our way through this room, notice how the silhouettes of chains closer to us, as the player, move past in the foreground. Similar to a bass track, you might not spot it at first, but you would definitely feel like something was missing if it wasn't there. It gives the room a better sense of scale, subconsciously tricking your brain into thinking that this is an actual gigantic 3-dimensional room, rather than just a level in a game. This room is massive, so we're going to start with the top and work our way downwards. Firstly, this room on the left opens up into a large chamber full of empty cocoons. In the dead centre, wailing cries emanate from a giant moustached grub. On trying to figure out what's got the old fella so upset, you might piece together that these cocoons probably shouldn't be empty, but it's okay if you don't fit that together just yet. For now, with nothing more to do, we can continue our exploration of the elevator shaft in the previous room. Carefully making our way downwards and definitely not getting hit by a stray tick-tick, we come across a hallway bustling with what appears to be verdant greenery. The sign in this room is excellently placed. Look at how it fits in perfectly with the law of the world. It's not at all unusual to see what is essentially a road sign directing travellers to the most industrial area in the land, but also narratively builds up our anticipation for the true scale of the world. Not only are we now looking forward to seeing what these verdant wilds and fungal groves are, but a certain mysterious majesty has been granted to this legendary city beneath it all. When we finally reach the city, this sign's promise of all wishes granted and all truths revealed will, at least subconsciously, trigger in our memory, further heightening the excitement at having finally reached it. But for now, we can only imagine the grandeur of such a place, and eagerly step forwards to begin exploring those verdant wilds. Of course, we are instantly stopped by this bastard who, try as we might, cannot be damaged simply by swinging our nail at him. It's very clearly shown to us that the reason we can't hurt the Elder Boulder is because of his strong outer shell that's too thick for our nail to penetrate, as shown by the metallic dinging of our nail on his back and the lack of any reaction on his end. But the theory is that if he were to somehow be attacked while he wasn't curled up like this, he would be vulnerable. Why else would he only curl in the second we got into melee range? For now, we will have to turn away and explore somewhere else. And so, we return to the elevator shaft, as yet unable to venture into Green Path. Expertly navigating our way through the elevator shaft this time, we enter this doorway on the right, where we encounter some familiar enemies. Although Hollow Knight is certainly not an easy game, more simplistic enemies like crawlids and vengeflies that we met in King's Pass are still used in this area. The first crawlid we meet here has the identical timer trick that the second crawlid we faced did, except instead of jumping out of a pit to fight it, we're jumping into one. Killing crawlids should be almost second nature by now, but that doesn't make it any less satisfying or build your confidence to a lesser degree. If you're a brand new player who faced their first crawlids with some level of trepidation, you would probably be feeling pretty proud of your progress if you managed to clear this room with no difficulty. In a game as harsh and unfriendly as Hollow Knight, these moments of confidence building, especially in the early game, are very appreciated. It's likely you'll spot this little grub in this alcove up here as you clear out this room. However you feel about grubs, you can't deny that the game does a hell of a lot to make you want to free these little guys. Look how sad they look trapped in those jars. Look at their little faces light up when they spot their potential saviour. Think about those happy little grub noises they make when they're freed, and the joy on their faces when you go back to the grub father's room to visit them. My personal compassion towards these things does go to pretty extreme lengths, but unfortunately not quite so far as to admit I know how to downward pogo these vengeflies. And so we are left unable to free this poor grub, and yet another clue is set to potentially trigger when we finally receive the Mothwing Cloak. The next room consists of a very long hallway with a couple of new enemies. Firstly, this Hornhead Husk, who we'll talk about in a bit, and secondly, this Jumping Husk. The first Jumping Husk is placed on this floating platform above us, and if you're comfortable with upward attacks now, you'll just hit it from below. The second Jumping Husk lurks on the far end of this corridor on terrifyingly equal ground. As their name suggests, the Jumping Husks leap through the atmosphere when they clock you, forcing you to move horizontally to avoid their attack. This enemy teaches us that jumping doesn't always solve our problems. You might have noticed that we move much slower when we're airborne and have much less control over the night. For normal enemies, having access to the second dimension provides a pretty clean method of dodging attacks from the sides, but when that dimension is heavily patrolled 50% of the time, it's far better to let the Jumping Husk go ahead and finish its path, and then stab it in the back. The other enemy we met in this room was the Hornhead Husk, who, similar to the Wandering Husk, will charge towards us when we enter its line of vision. The Hornhead's charges, however, aren't interrupted with a little breather that the Wandering Husks are, and it will keep charging forwards for a couple of seconds before turning around and trying again. This enemy is perfect to practice jumping over, especially with this little nook directly above it, the placement of which also encourages us to use the environment to our advantage when picking fights with these mad inhabitants of the world. I believe that the placement of these two enemies in conjunction with one another here is meant to cause a bit of dissonance in your mind surrounding the jump mechanic. It's incredibly useful for some enemies, but a hindrance for dealing with others. Jump wisely, young knight. Now, if you're a bit of a clever clogs like me, after killing this vengefly you'll be perceptive enough to spot our old friend the stalactite in the ceiling between these spike pits. Another haunting reminder of the numerous beatings we took in King's Pass, and a quick tempering of our confidence, just in case we're getting too big for our boots. Dropping down into the room below us, we find ourselves unable to progress due to these metal doors blocking the way. If you're a genius, you might recognise the contraption beneath you as a lever, and therefore indication that you're meant to find another way around to access this room, but I think you'd be forgiven for not spotting this. Still, the use of one-way doors like this to give you a glimpse at what's to come helps build intrigue and acts as our first look at the interesting level design Hollow Knight has. There's clearly a correct way to explore the Forgotten Crossroads, that correct way being the one where you're forced to spot Cornifer and unlock the map mechanic, as well as draw you closer to all the goodies held in the bottom right corner of the Crossroads. The one-way path is put in place to ensure that we're not skipping anything important like that, but still validating our choice of exploration so far. And so we are forced to return to the previous room and continue our exploration elsewhere. Handily dealing with a couple of vengeflies and collecting a small sum of geo for our efforts, we enter the room next to this. Now, I already touched on area transitions a little bit, and this will probably be a couple of paragraphs at the start of the next video on Green Path 2, but I specifically want to talk about how the music prepares you for entering a new area. Very quick disclaimer before we begin this section. When I talk about music, it's 100% enthusiasm and actually nothing musically knowledgeable. Apologies in advance if I say something incredibly dumb here. I'm gonna shut up now for a second so you can hear a little better. Pay attention to what happens to the Forgotton Crossroads theme when we enter this room. For reference, here's what it sounds like normally. So this theme features this intermittent droning. A piano chord will play and accompanying strings will echo it for a few bars, slowly fading in and then slowly fading out, which gives the impression that the world around you is breathing. There's also this occasional gentle tinkling of something pizzicato that plays over this every so often. But listen to what happens now we come to a potential exit point for the Forgotton Crossroads into Crystal Peak. Suddenly, those piano chords marking the point of each breath have gone, and the orchestra is left on its own. The orchestra sounds almost lost without its piano brother to guide it. In addition, this odd, echoing, dissonant sound plays occasionally, like a rumble of ancient debris miles away collapsing. All this is meant to represent a departure from the familiar and an introduction to the unknown. We've been listening to the Forgotton Crossroads theme for about 7 minutes straight now, and its gentle piano plus orchestra breathing pattern has probably wedged itself comfortably into your brain. The sudden loss of the piano keeps the theme feeling familiar, but mentally prepares you for a change, in this case, Crystal Peak. Another step deeper towards the peak and we lose the strings altogether, leaving only the creepy echoing. We're not quite in the peak yet, so it shouldn't start playing the Crystal Peak theme, but we're definitely no longer in the Crossroads, so it can't be playing that either. We're between levels, in limbo, listening to nothing but the rumbling breathing of the land itself. There is another sound, however, that greets our ears in this passage. At first, just the gentle clinking of a pickaxe on rock, but as we draw closer, a melodic singing in a time signature only ever used to summon things reaches our ears. Inquisitively, we wander between the rails of a disused minecart track, past the dilapidated wreck of a fallen pulley system, and between the giant pink crystals protruding from the ground, until we reach the source of the singing, an apparently very content little bug. Myla's unfortunate existence in this game serves first to further strengthen the believability that this world has some form of industry, or at least society, living in it, and secondly, and much more importantly, to demonstrate the effects of the plague. When we first approach her, it's clear she's not an enemy. The echoing tune she's humming sets her apart from all the moaning husks we've been slicing through, but visually we can see she doesn't yet have those iconic orange eyes that have been a feature of every mad being down here. If you haven't noticed this eye thing yet as a player, this could be the point where you start to piece together that orange equals bad. Listening to Myla reveals the lyrics of the song she's singing, a deeply, almost comedically grim song about the eternal entombment of her closest relatives' corpses. The lyrics clash so harshly with her almost childlike tone of voice that it makes you want to laugh in shock. I've never seen any proper analysis of this poem, and as much as I would love to spend the next half an hour picking this apart, I unfortunately don't have that much to say about it either. All I would point out is that the last line, "Let's bury me too," with a jaunty little exclamation mark following the horde of O's, reinforces the dissonance between the dark lyrics and the childlike tone in which they're being sung. You're not dead, Myla. Do you even know what you're singing? She probably just likes the tune. I believe the reason this poem is here is to instantly make Myla a memorable, likeable character. Who could forget the morbid little miner girl in this, at present, very distinctive room, singing about the death of her family? We should definitely come back here later. Maybe she's got a cool story that we can learn more about once we've advanced further. Of course, we will be back here to talk more about Myla in the future, so I'm not going to start going off on one about her whole plague thing just yet. For now, her song, and further dialogue, only serves to benefit world building a bit, and reinforce how cute and innocent and basically harmless she is. Save for the dialogue that appears when you talk to her a second time, in which she mentions she's forgotten the rest of the lyrics to her song. Of course, this can always be passed off as her just being childish and forgetful, but it does plant those damn seeds that her mind is starting to be consumed as she mines away at this strangely orange vein. Continuing on away from Myla for now, thank God, we find an actual operating lift. Swinging at these crystals a bit reveals that the statues and grass we found in King's Pass and the Forgotton Crossroads aren't just to introduce new players to the combat, but also to provide a bit of stress relief to older players as they shatter into millions of tiny dopamine shards at your feet. You might also notice this nook off to the left with your first soul totem at the end. Although this is poorly shown in my gameplay due to me being too much of a Hollow Knight pro to need additional soul at this point, a new player would almost certainly learn here that these can be hit to gain more soul. I have a whole lot of stuff to say about the soul mechanic, but I'm going to restrain myself until I can talk about spells with it. For now, let's carry on into the next room, which is seemingly a dead end. The ground here rumbles suspiciously beneath our feet, and, if we think back to the collapsing floor in King's Pass, we can recall that the earth around us can be subject to gravity. The blood sac pumping away beneath us is basically screaming that there's more stuff in this direction, and the fact that we have no clue what it even is only heightens our curiosity. But, try as we might, no amount of jumping or walking around is going to crack open the mines beneath us. And so, yet another flag is stuck in our brains for something to come back to later when we're better equipped to deal with it. Going back on ourselves, we return to the Crossroads, but notably, the steady control of the piano is still absent. We jump upwards and head into this room on the right. The strings, still alone and unsure of themselves, take a hesitant breath, as if in anticipation. And then we see it. At the end of the room, a monstrous husk stands, hunched over, a club the same size as he is, propped easily upon his shoulder. We take one step too close, and with a grumble of realization, the giant husk guard turns to face us and readies his club. The strings instantly spike in terror. A series of endless staccato notes pierce the usually calm atmosphere as the guard slams into the ground, sending a powerful shockwave towards us. I feel like if you haven't taken a death yet, this will be the first place it happens. The Husk Guard is a massive step up in terms of enemy difficulty. Everything up to this point has pretty much attacked you just by running into you, and the only difference between their attacks has been how frequently they come and how fast. Even if you'd killed Gruzmother by now, you'd still most likely be unable to deal with the Husk Guard. It has two main attacks, this Havelbonk that he can bring out nightmarishly quickly, and the Ground Pound, which sends a shockwave charging at you like a runaway train. When he raises the club above his head to do the bonk move, you've got just enough time to get one attack in and then retreat. Any more than one, you get hit. But all we've learned up to this point is to attack. Combine that with the fact that it deals 2 musks of damage per hit, plus the shockwave for when we're further away, culminates in an almost certain death here. Black void particles weep into the atmosphere. The night's cloak billows out around it, ripping into shreds by some unknown gale from within. Its body congeals into a black, otherworldly goo, and its mask pops off its face, splitting slightly on impact with the ground as a new, ghastly black creature sprouts from the void within the night. We see it writhe for a moment, before the screen fades to black.